The rain hammered the roof of the old Chevy, each drop a tiny fist against Elias Carter's resolve. 20 years ago, his family had cast him out like trash onto these same Seattle streets. Their words sharper than any storm. "You're no son of ours." Now, at 38, he sat parked outside the house that had once been home, staring at the faded green door that had slammed shut behind him. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. The letter in his pocket, creased, worn, and unopened for weeks, burned against his chest. It was from his mother, Margaret, the woman who'd stood silent as his father's rage drove him away at 18. The letter promised answers, an apology, a plea to return. But Elias wasn't here for her. Not yet. He was here for himself, for the man he'd become despite their rejection. The city had changed, but the ache in his chest hadn't. Seattle's skyline glittered through the rain, a mix of sleek towers and gritty charm, much like Elias himself. He'd clawed his way from homeless shelters to a modest apartment, from shame to pride, from loneliness to a life he'd built with his own hands. He was a chef now, running a small but beloved diner called Haven in Capitol Hill, a place where misfits found family. But the past had a way of knocking, and tonight it was loud. Elias stepped out of the truck, rain soaking his navy jacket. The house on 14th Avenue looked smaller than he remembered, its paint peeling like old skin. He hadn't planned to come here, not until the letter arrived, stirring memories he'd buried. His boots crunched on the gravel path, each step heavier than the last. What did they want now? Forgiveness? Absolution? He wasn't sure he had either to give. At the diner earlier that day, his partner, Julian Navarro, had urged him to face this. Julian, 39, with sharp cheekbones and a quiet strength, had been Elias's anchor for 3 years. "You don't owe them anything," Julian had said, his hand warm on Elias's. "But you owe yourself closure." Julian's words echoed now as Elias stood before the door, heart pounding. He raised his fist to knock but froze. What if they hadn't changed? What if this was another trap? The door swung open before he could decide. His younger sister, Lila, stood there, 32 and wide-eyed, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. "Elias!" Her voice cracked, a mix of shock and hope. She lunged forward, arms open, but he stepped back, his face a mask of stone. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low. Lila's smile faltered, but she didn't retreat. "They want to see you." "Mom, she's sick, Elias. Please." He didn't move. "Sick?" The word hit like a punch, but he steeled himself. 20 years, Lila. They threw me out. You didn't stop them." Her eyes welled up, but Elias felt no pity, only the weight of old wounds. He turned to leave, but her hand caught his sleeve. "Wait, there's something you need to know." Elias didn't want to hear it, but Lila's grip was desperate. She led him inside, the house smelling of cedar and regret. The living room was unchanged. Same floral curtains, same creaky floorboards. His mother sat in an armchair, frail and gray at 62, her hands trembling around a cup of tea. His father, Richard, stood by the window, his broad shoulders hunched, older now at 65, but still imposing. Neither spoke as Elias entered, their silence louder than the storm outside. Lila sat him down, her voice shaking as she explained. Margaret had cancer, terminal. She had months, maybe less. The letter had been her idea, a last attempt to mend what they'd broken. Richard, ever stubborn, had resisted, but even he had softened, Lila claimed. Elias listened, his face unreadable. He wanted to feel something. Anger, sadness, anything. but all he felt was cold. "You don't get to summon me like I'm still your son," he said finally, his voice cutting through the room. Margaret's eyes, red-rimmed, met his. "I failed you," she whispered. "I let fear win. I'm so sorry, Elias." Her words hung there, fragile and late. Richard shifted, his jaw tight, but said nothing. Elias stood, ready to leave, when Lila grabbed his hand. "There's a box," she said. "Your things. From back then. We kept them." Against his better judgment, Elias followed her to the attic. The box was small, dust-covered, filled with relics of his youth. A mixtape he'd made at 16, a photo of him and Lila at the pier, a journal filled with his teenage dreams. He traced the pages, his throat tight. These were pieces of a boy he'd forced himself to forget. "Why keep this?" he asked, voice raw. Lila's eyes softened. "Because we hoped you'd come back." He left without another word, the box under his arm, the letter still unopened. Back in his truck, he sat in the dark, rain blurring the windshield. Julian's face flashed in his mind. Those steady eyes, that quiet love. Elias wasn't sure what he'd come here for, but he knew one thing. He wasn't that scared 18-year-old anymore. Whatever came next, he'd face it on his terms. Back at Haven, the diner buzzed with its usual late-night crowd. Students, artists, and wanderers drawn to the warmth of its mismatched chairs and neon sign. Elias stood behind the counter, flipping burgers, his hands moving on autopilot. The box from the attic sat in the back office, unopened since last night. Julian, wiping down tables, glanced at him with concern. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough to keep it private. Elias nodded, but his tight jaw said otherwise. The truth was, Elias hadn't slept. The letter, still unopened, sat on his nightstand like a grenade. He'd spent hours staring at it, torn between burning it and reading it. Julian had stayed quiet, giving him space, but his presence was a lifeline. At 39, Julian had his own scars. Growing up queer in a small Texas town hadn't been kind, but he wore them lightly, his humor and warmth a shield. Elias envied that ease, especially now. That afternoon, a new face walked into Haven. A woman, mid-30s, with short black hair and a leather jacket, slid into a booth. She introduced herself as Samira, a journalist working on a story about queer resilience in Seattle. "I heard about this place," she said, her eyes sharp but kind. "People say it's a sanctuary. I want to know your story, Elias." He froze, spatula in hand. His story, he'd spent years building walls around it. Samira was persistent, her questions gentle but probing. Elias gave her the basics. Kicked out at 18, survived the streets, built Haven. But when she asked about his family, he clammed up. "Some things are better left buried," he said, turning back to the grill. Samira didn't push, but she left her card. "If you change your mind, I'm listening." That night, alone in their apartment above the diner, Elias finally opened the letter. Julian sat across from him, sipping coffee, his presence steadying. Margaret's handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "I was wrong. I let your father's anger and my own fear blind me. You were my son and I failed you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I love you." The words hit like a tidal wave, cracking something in Elias he'd thought was unbreakable. He shoved the letter back in its envelope, his hands trembling. Julian reached for him, but Elias pulled away. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted, voice hoarse. "They don't get to just say sorry and expect it to fix everything." Julian nodded, his eyes soft. "They don't. But you get to decide what it means for you. The next day, Lila showed up at Haven. She looked out of place among the neon lights and vinyl booths, her sweater too prim for the diner's eclectic vibe. "I'm not here to push," she said, clutching a coffee mug. "But Mom's worse. She's asking for you." Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her to leave, to take her guilt and go. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Lila's hands shook, or the way she looked at him like he was still her big brother. "Give me time," he said finally. Lila nodded, leaving a photo on the counter. A faded Polaroid of Elias and his parents at a 4th of July barbecue. Back when he was 15 and still their golden boy. He stared at it long after she left, the memory sharp and bitter. That night, he told Julian about the photo, about the summer days before everything fell apart. Julian listened, his hand resting on Elias's knee, grounding him. By the end of the week, Elias made a decision. He'd go back. Not for them, but for himself. He needed to see Margaret, to look her in the eyes and say what he'd held in for 20 years. He didn't know if it would be forgiveness or farewell, but it would be his choice. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Elias walked through the sterile halls, his boots echoing against the linoleum. Julian had offered to come, but Elias needed to do this alone. Room 412 was at the end of the corridor, the door half open. Margaret lay there, a shadow of the woman who'd once baked him cookies and sung him to sleep. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but Elias's face stayed hard. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." He stood by the door, arms crossed, the box from the attic tucked under his arm. He hadn't planned to bring it, but it felt like armor. "I'm not here to make you feel better," he said. "I'm here to understand why." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She spoke slowly, her words punctuated by labored breaths. She told him about her regret, about the nights she'd lain awake wondering where he was, about the fear that had kept her silent when Richard's fury took over. "I was weak," she admitted. "I thought I was protecting our family, but I lost you instead." Elias listened, his jaw tight. Her words were raw, honest, but they didn't erase the years he'd spent sleeping on park benches, the nights he'd cried himself to sleep in shelters. "You don't get to rewrite the past," he said. "You stood there while he called me a disgrace. You let him throw me out." Margaret reached for his hand, but he didn't move. "I know," she said, "and I'll carry that shame forever. But you're here, and that means something." Elias didn't respond. He set the box on the bedside table, its contents a silent accusation. "I found this," he said. "Why keep it if you were done with me?" She touched the box, her fingers trembling. "Because you were my son. You still are." Elias's throat tightened, but he pushed the feeling down. He left without another word, the hospital's fluorescent lights burning his eyes. Outside, he leaned against the wall, catching his breath. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Closure? Rage? Maybe both. But all he felt was a hollow ache. Back at Haven, Julian was waiting. He didn't ask questions, just pulled Elias into a hug. For the first time in days, Elias let himself lean into it, the warmth of Julian's arms anchoring him. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he admitted. Julian kissed his forehead. "You don't have to. Just figure out what you need." That night, Samira returned to the diner. She'd heard about Elias's visit to the hospital. Lila had mentioned it in a community group chat. "Your story's bigger than you think," Samira said, her notebook open. "People need to hear it. Not just the pain, but the strength." Elias hesitated, then started talking. He told her about the streets, the diner, Julian. He didn't mention the letter or the box, but he felt lighter with every word. By the end of the night, Elias made another decision. He'd see Margaret again, not to forgive, but to listen. Maybe there was something worth salvaging, even if it was just understanding. The second hospital visit was harder. Elias sat across from Margaret, the box open between them. She'd asked to see it, to remember the boy she'd lost. They went through it together, his old journal, the mixtape, a dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Each item was a bridge to a past neither could fully reclaim. Margaret's stories were small but vivid. Elias sneaking extra cookies, Lila trailing him like a shadow. For a moment, Elias felt like that boy again, but the feeling didn't last. "I don't know how to fix this," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "but I want to try." Elias looked at her, frail and fading, and felt a crack in his resolve. He didn't forgive her, not yet, but he saw her humanity, her flaws. "I needed you then," he said quietly. "Not now." He left the hospital with a strange mix of relief and guilt. Back at Haven, Samira's article was taking shape, and word was spreading. Customers started sharing their own stories. Queer kids disowned, families torn apart, second chances found. The diner became more than a restaurant. It was a beacon. Elias felt pride but also pressure. His story wasn't just his anymore. Julian noticed the strain. One night, as they closed up, he pulled Elias onto the cliffside trail near their apartment. The Pacific stretched out below, waves crashing under a starlit sky. "You're carrying too much," Julian said, his hand finding Elias's. "Let me help." Elias looked at him, the man who'd chosen him despite his scars, and felt something shift. He kissed Julian, slow and deep, the ocean's roar drowning out the world. The next day, Richard showed up at Haven. Elias froze, spatula in hand, as his father stood in the doorway, looking out of place in his pressed shirt. "I'm not here to fight," Richard said, his voice gruff. I need to say something." Elias braced himself, expecting the worst. Instead, Richard's eyes softened. "I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. I'm sorry." Elias stared, the words sinking in. He wanted to lash out, to throw Richard's apology back in his face. But he didn't. "I heard you," he said finally. "That's all I can give you right now." Richard nodded, leaving without another word. Elias felt the weight of 20 years shift, just a little. That night, he and Julian talked for hours. Elias admitted he didn't know if he could forgive, but he wanted to try, for himself, not them. Julian smiled, his eyes warm. "That's enough for now." Margaret passed 2 months later. Elias was there, holding her hand as she slipped away. He didn't forgive her, not fully, but he'd made peace with her humanity. At the funeral, he stood apart from Lila and Richard, Julian by his side. The service was small, held in a quiet Seattle chapel, the rain a soft backdrop. Elias didn't speak, but he left a single photo from the box on her casket, a picture of them laughing together when he was 10. It was enough. Richard approached him after, his face lined with grief. "I don't expect you to want me in your life," he said, "but I'm here if you ever do." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know if he'd ever take that step, but the door wasn't fully closed. Samira's article ran in a local paper, then went viral online. Haven became a pilgrimage site for queer youth, a place where stories were shared over coffee and pie. Elias and Julian expanded the diner, adding a community space for support groups. It wasn't easy, Elias still wrestled with his past, but it felt right. One evening, As they stood on the cliffside trail, Elias turned to Julian. "I wouldn't have made it through this without you," he said, his voice steady. Julian smiled, pulling him close. "We made it together." They stood there, the ocean stretching endless before them, their hands entwined. Elias had spent 20 years building a life from ashes, and now he knew he was home. The knock from his past had brought pain, but it had also brought clarity. Elias didn't need his family's approval anymore. He had Julian, Haven, and a community that chose him. The silence he'd answered their knock with wasn't cold anymore. It was his strength, his truth, his way forward.